The thermometer outside read -22, and Elena Cross was watching her daughter's breath turn to fog inside their own living room. She had called 7 companies. 7. Every single one told her the same thing. Not tonight, ma'am, not in this storm, and hung up before she could finish begging. Her daughter Lily was 6 years old, wrapped in every blanket they owned and still shaking. One call left. One name on a crumpled business card she'd found stuck to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a pine tree. She dialed. It rang 4 times. Then someone answered. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay with me until the very end. Let's go. The snow had been falling since 2 in the afternoon, and by the time the clock on Elena Cross's microwave read 11:47 p.m., Blackridge, Montana had effectively ceased to exist. That was the only way to describe it, ceased to exist, because beyond the frost-clouded glass of her farmhouse windows, there was nothing left. No road, no tree line, no mailbox at the end of the gravel path she had walked 100 times in summer. Just white, just howling, suffocating, absolute white, and a wind that didn't so much blow as attack, slamming against the old wooden walls of the farmhouse like it had a personal grudge. Elena stood at the kitchen window with her arms crossed tight over her chest, not a pose of stubbornness, but of cold, the kind of cold that gets into your bones before you even realize it's winning. The furnace had died at 9:45. She knew the exact time because she'd been sitting on the couch with Lily, watching some cartoon about a dog who solved mysteries, and the heat had simply stopped. No dramatic sputter, no final groan. The registers had just gone quiet, and within 20 minutes, the temperature inside the house had started dropping with a speed that scared her. She'd done what any reasonable person would do. She'd called the heating company whose magnet was on her fridge, the one she'd used last October when the pilot light kept going out. Line busy. She'd called the second number she found online. Voicemail. Third number. A man who answered listened to her describe the situation and then said, with what she could only describe as practiced regret, Ma'am, we can't send anyone out in these conditions. Roads closed between here and town. I'm sorry. He didn't sound sorry. She'd called 4 more after that. One laughed. Actually laughed. Not cruelly, but with the exhausted humor of a man who'd fielded impossible requests all night. Lady, I got 3 guys stuck in ditches already. Nobody's moving tonight. 7 calls. 7 no's. She stood at the window and tried to think clearly, which was hard when the air inside your kitchen was already 48 degrees and dropping. Lily was in the living room, burrowed under the couch blanket and both sleeping bags Elena had found in the hall closet. Relics from a camping trip they'd taken 2 summers ago, back when things were different, back when she'd still believed that a change of scenery could fix what was broken between her and Gavin. Lily hadn't complained yet. She was at that age where she mostly trusted that the adults in the room had everything handled. Elena was trying very hard to be someone who had everything handled. She pulled open the junk drawer, say, everyone has one, the drawer that collects everything that doesn't belong anywhere else, and started going through it with fingers that were starting to feel thick and clumsy. Old takeout menus, a dead flashlight, rubber bands, and then, near the back, stuck to the bottom of the drawer with some ancient dried syrup she didn't want to think about, a business card, Mercer Heating and Repair. Declan Mercer, licensed technician, available after hours for emergency service. Handwritten at the bottom, in actual pen, in the scratchy handwriting of someone who didn't much care about penmanship. Call the cell, always answer. She almost didn't call. It was nearly midnight. The card looked old. The edges were soft. The printing slightly faded. For all she knew, the number was disconnected, or the man had moved, or retired, or... She dialed. It rang once, twice, 3 times. She was already composing the voicemail in her head. Hi, I know this is insane, I'm sorry to bother you. When the line clicked open. Yeah. Not hello. Not the name of the company. Just yeah, like he'd been awake and was simply confirming it. She stopped. Started again. My name is Elena Cross. I live out on Sutter Road, about 9 miles past the Blackridge Junction. My furnace died about 2 hours ago, and I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I've called 7 other companies, and nobody will come out, and She caught herself before her voice could crack, because she was not going to cry on the phone to a stranger. She had decided that firmly. I don't know what else to do. Silence for a moment. Not the silence of someone who wasn't listening, more like the silence of someone who was actually thinking. Sutter Road, he said. The farmhouse with the red barn that leans? She blinked. Yes. You know it? Passed it a few times. Old place. A pause. How cold is it inside? She looked at the small thermometer she'd dug out of her camping kit. 46. 45 now, actually. Another pause. Longer this time. And your daughter, she okay? She's under everything we own. She's not complaining, but she's 6, so... Yeah. She heard something in the background, the scrape of a chair like he was standing up. What's the furnace? Do you know the model? No. I can look. It's okay. I'll figure it out when I get there. He paused. Sutter Road is going to be bad tonight. I know, she said. I know. I'm sorry. If you can't... I didn't say I can't. His voice wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't cold either. It was just flat, factual. Give me 45 minutes. Keep your daughter in the interior room with the most blankets. Kitchen probably holds heat better than the living room. Smaller space. And if you've got any candles, light them. Not for warmth, but they help. Okay. Don't open the front door until you hear me knock 3 times. You understand? In this storm, you open doors, you lose heat fast. 3 knocks, she repeated. Okay. 45 minutes, he said again, and then he hung up. Elena stood in her kitchen for a moment with the phone pressed against her sternum, not sure if she felt relief or just a different flavor of anxiety. She went to light the candles. Declan Mercer had not been planning to sleep. He hadn't been planning much of anything, which was more or less the permanent condition of his evenings. He lived in a house on the outskirts of Blackridge that was technically too big for one person, but that he'd never gotten around to downsizing because the idea of packing boxes required a kind of sustained intention he hadn't been capable of in 3 years. The house was clean. He was a clean person by nature, but it was the cleanliness of a place where nothing ever got messy, because nothing ever really happened there. The couch had 2 cushions that no one ever sat on. The kitchen table had 4 chairs, one of which he used and 3 of which held his toolboxes and work bags because it was easier than carrying them to the garage every night. He'd been sitting at the one chair he used, drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, doing paperwork he'd been putting off for a week, when the phone rang. He listened to the woman on the other end, her voice carefully controlled, like someone gripping a rope over a drop, and looked out his window at the storm. It was genuinely bad. He was honest with himself about that. The roads between his place and Sutter Road would be ugly. County plows had given up on secondary routes hours ago. His truck was good. 4-wheel drive, winter tires, chains in the back. But good wasn't the same as invincible. He stood up, went to his gear closet, and started pulling on layers. He wasn't a man who spent a lot of time examining his own motivations. He probably should have. His therapist, the one he'd seen for about 8 months after Sarah died, the one he'd stopped seeing not because he'd gotten better, but because he'd gotten tired, had told him once that he was an action-oriented avoider, which he'd understood to mean that he handled difficult feelings by doing things, by fixing things. It wasn't the healthiest pattern, the therapist had acknowledged, but it wasn't the worst one either. Right now, the thing that needed fixing was a farmhouse on Sutter Road with a dead furnace and a child inside it. He grabbed his heavy duffel, the one with the portable electric heater he brought on jobs where things might take overnight, and went out to the truck. The cold hit him like a shove. Odd. He almost went into the ditch twice on Sutter Road. The first time he caught it, correcting slowly and evenly the way you learn to do in Montana winters if you're going to survive them. No jerking the wheel, no panic, just steady counterpressure and patience. The second time was worse. A long sideways slide that lasted 4 full seconds while the truck's back end drifted toward a drainage ditch, and he just held on and breathed and let the tires find grip again. The farmhouse appeared out of the storm like a painting, the red barn leaning exactly as he'd remembered it, and the house behind it with the ghost of candlelight visible even through the frosted windows. He knocked 3 times. The door opened almost immediately, and the woman standing in it was not what he'd pictured from the phone call. He wasn't sure what he'd pictured exactly. Someone more visibly desperate, maybe. More undone. But Elena Cross looked like someone who had made a decision to hold herself together and was following through with grim commitment. She was maybe 32, 33, with dark circles under sharp eyes, and her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she hadn't touched it in hours. She was wearing a coat inside her own home. "Declan Mercer?" she said, like she needed confirmation that the man standing in her doorway was who she'd called and not some weather-related hallucination. "Yeah," he said. "Where's the furnace?" The furnace was in the basement. Of course it was in the basement. A 23-year-old unit that had clearly been limping along on borrowed time and prayers for at least the last several winters. Declan crouched in front of it with his headlamp on and his breath fogging in the 51-degree air, and ran through the diagnostics with the methodical patience of a man who had done this so many times it had become a form of muscle memory. He heard small footsteps on the stairs above him, then a voice, 6-year-old and unimpressed. "Mom said there's a man fixing the heater." "That's me," Declan said, without looking up from the heat exchanger he was examining. "Are you almost done?" "Not yet." "How long?" "Lily." Elena's voice from the top of the stairs. "It's okay," Declan said. And then to Lily, "Probably a while, maybe until morning." A pause. "Morning?" Lily said with the gravity of someone receiving very significant news. "Maybe. Your furnace is pretty sick. Can you fix sick furnaces?" "Usually." "What if you can't fix this one?" He finally looked up at her. She was at the bottom of the stairs now, a small kid, dark-haired like her mother, with a blanket draped over her shoulders like a superhero cape, and an expression of serious scientific inquiry on her face. "Then we keep you warm another way until I can get the part it needs," he said. "You'll be okay either way. I promise." Lily considered this. "Okay," she said, with the decisive efficiency of a child who had gotten a sufficient answer and was ready to move on. She turned and went back up the stairs. Elena appeared at the top. "Sorry, she's fine," he said, and he meant it. The problem, when he fully diagnosed it, was a cracked heat exchanger, a failure point that wasn't a quick fix, not at midnight, not in a blizzard. The part he needed wasn't something he carried in his truck. Nobody would. It was too unit specific. He could get it, but not until morning, not until roads opened and his supplier and Billings could process an emergency order. He sat back on his heels and looked at the dead furnace for a long moment. Then he went back up the stairs to tell Elena Cross that tonight the furnace was staying broken. She took it better than he expected. "Okay," she said. She was sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that was probably lukewarm at best. Lily was on the couch behind her, already mostly asleep again. "So what do we do?" "I have a portable electric heater in the truck," he said. "I use it on jobs where I need to work overnight. It's a good unit. It can hold one room, maybe two if they're small, and you keep the doors shut." "You carry one of those with you? Sometimes jobs aren't one-night things." He didn't explain further. "I can set it up in whatever room you want. Living room, probably, since that's where—" He nodded toward Lily. "She's already settled." "That's—" Elena stopped. "That's really above and beyond. We can manage with blankets. You don't have to— "I have the heater in the truck," he said, with the quiet firmness of a man who had already decided. "I'll get it." He went out into the storm, came back with the heater and a power strip and a small toolkit. Set it up in the living room while Elena moved Lily to the couch's better cushion without waking her. The heater hummed to life, and Declan watched the air register. The room would be manageable within 20 minutes, tolerable within 40. "Can I make you coffee?" Elena asked. She was watching him from the doorway, and her expression was complicated in a way he didn't try to read. "Real coffee. I mean, I've got a French press." "Sure," he said. "Thanks." He sat at her kitchen table while she made coffee, and neither of them said anything for a minute, which was not as uncomfortable as it should have been. "You drove through that," she said finally, nodding toward the window. "In this." Everyone else said it was impossible." "Not impossible," he said. "Just not worth it to them." She looked at him for a moment over the French press. "Why was it worth it to you?" He thought about it. Actually thought, instead of giving a reflex answer. "You had a kid in a freezing house," he said. What else was I going to do? Elena said nothing for a moment. Then she pressed the plunger down slowly and poured 2 mugs. I'm not going to pretend that's not the most decent thing anyone said to me in a while, she said. He almost said that's a low bar, but didn't. Because it wasn't a joke, not the way she said it. How long have you been out here? He asked instead. On Sutter Road. 2 years. Just over. She sat down across from him with her own mug. We moved here after things ended. With Lily's father. She said it the way people say things they've practiced, keeping the shape clean so the contents don't spill. I grew up outside of Billings. I wanted to be close enough to my sister, but far enough from everything else. Makes sense? It does until a blizzard. He almost smiled. Yeah, until a blizzard. Lily shifted on the couch and made a small sound in her sleep, and both of them looked over automatically, the instinct of anyone near a sleeping child. She's stubborn, Elena said quietly. She doesn't really know how to be scared. I think she gets it from my side of the family. A pause. Or she's just better at hiding it than I am. She asked me if I could fix sick furnaces, Declan said. Elena's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but close to one. Did she? What did you tell her? Usually. That's honest. Seemed like a kid who'd appreciate honesty more than reassurance. Elena looked at him. Yeah, she said quietly. She is. The wind hit the house sideways, hard enough to shudder the walls, and both of them looked up at the ceiling instinctively. The sound of it, the raw, aggressive roar of the storm, made the kitchen feel smaller and the coffee feel more necessary. You can stay, Elena said. She said it quickly, and then corrected course, making it practical. I mean, if the roads are that bad, you shouldn't drive back tonight. I have a couch. She paused. Another couch? In the spare room? It's actually a fold-out. He looked at his phone. The road conditions app showed Sutter Road as the specific red that meant do not attempt. He'd known that on the drive here. He'd sort of accepted it before he left. If it's not a problem, he said, it's not a problem. Neither of them had anything else to say about it, so they didn't say anything, which turned out to be fine. He slept 4 hours on the fold-out, which was not comfortable, but was not the most uncomfortable he'd slept in his life. He woke at 5:30, as he always did. His body didn't seem to understand the concept of sleeping in, and lay still for a minute in the dark, listening to the storm. It had quieted. Not stopped. He could still hear wind, but the fury of the night before had backed off into something more ordinary. He got up, found the kitchen by memory, and made coffee with the French press Elena had left on the counter. He stood at the window with the mug and watched the pre-dawn light turn the snow from black to gray to the particular blue-white of a Montana morning after a blizzard, and he thought about nothing in particular, which was different from the nothing he usually thought about in his own kitchen, which always had a slightly hollowed-out quality to it. This nothing was just quiet, just a house resting after a long night. He heard small footsteps at 6:10. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in footy pajamas with a pattern of foxes on them. She looked at him with the unself-conscious assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend not to stare. You stayed, she said. Roads were bad. Did you sleep? Some? Are you fixing the heater today? Need to get a part first. After I get the part, yes. She came into the kitchen and sat in one of the chairs at the table, pulling her feet up underneath her. What do you want for breakfast? She asked, with the authority of a child who had apparently decided she lived here and he was the guest. I'll just have coffee, he said. We have eggs, she said, as though he hadn't spoken. And there's frozen waffles, but those are better in the toaster oven, and Mom says the toaster oven takes forever, but I don't think forever. I think 5 minutes. She considered this. Maybe 7 minutes. What are you having? He asked. Frozen waffles, she said. Obviously. He looked at her. She looked back at him with absolute composure. 7 minutes, huh? He said. Maybe 8, she allowed. Elena came downstairs at 6:45 to find Declan at her kitchen table with 2 empty waffle plates in front of him, and her daughter explaining, at length and with great feeling, the complete plot of a cartoon about a dog detective. She stopped in the doorway. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Some version of awkward morning-after courtesy, Probably. Thank you so much. I'll be out of your hair. Here's what I'll charge you. Not this. Not our 6-year-old monologuing at a stranger who was listening with what appeared to be genuine attention, or at least a very convincing facsimile of it. Morning, Declan said, catching her in the doorway. Morning. She looked at the plates. Did you? She insisted, he said. Obviously, said Lily, without pausing. Elena went to the coffee press and found it already warm. He'd kept heat under it with one of the candles she'd left out, which was the kind of small, practical thoughtfulness that she noticed but didn't quite know what to do with. She poured a cup and leaned against the counter and listened to her daughter tell a man she'd met 8 hours ago about a cartoon dog, and thought, this is very strange. And also, somehow, this is fine. He left at 8:30 to get the part. The morning roads were bad but passable. County crews had been running plows since 4 a.m. He made it to his supplier contact in Whitefish, closer than Billings, it turned out, and the man owed him a favor, and had the heat exchanger by 10. He drove back to Sutter Road with it in the passenger seat like cargo he needed to protect. He had the furnace running by 1 in the afternoon. He went upstairs from the basement to find Elena in the kitchen cutting apples and Lily on the living room floor doing something with crayons, and told Elena the heat was back on and would hold. She set down the apple and the knife and said thank you. Simple. No performance to it. I'll leave you an invoice, he said, reaching for the pad he kept in his breast pocket. Of course. What do I owe you? He wrote a number down. The number he wrote was the wholesale cost of the part. Nothing else. No labor for the drive out. No charge for the emergency service. No overnight rate. Just the part. He wasn't completely sure why he did it that way. He'd thought about it on the drive back with the heat exchanger in the passenger seat, and he hadn't arrived at a clear reason. He just couldn't make himself add to a number he'd seen on her face the night before. The specific math of someone calculating what they can afford to lose. He handed her the invoice. She looked at it for a second longer than she should have. This is just the part, she said. Yep. What about your labor? The drive? You were here all night. Roads were bad, he said. Not your fault the roads were bad. She looked up at him. Her expression was doing something he couldn't read completely. Something between gratitude and something more complicated, like the discomfort of receiving something unexpected from someone you haven't figured out yet. Declan, she said. It's fine, he said. And then, because he wasn't very good at being thanked, and never had been. Make sure you run the system for an hour before you trust it completely. If the pressure gauge does anything weird, call me. He wrote his direct cell number on a separate piece of paper, sets, not the business card, just his number, on a notepad page, and left it on the counter next to her apple. She was still holding the invoice when he walked out the front door and back into the cold. He drove home through roads that were recovering slowly, the snowbanks on either side higher than his truck's roof, the sky the particular blank white of a Montana winter that had decided to stay a while. He wasn't a man who examined his own feelings with any regularity. He preferred the language of systems, of diagnostic sequences and pressure readings and cause and effect. Feelings were less tidy. They didn't come with repair manuals. But somewhere between Sutter Road and his own empty house, Declan Mercer registered something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness, exactly. Not anything that dramatic. Just the faint, almost physical sense that he had done something that mattered. That the hours between midnight and this morning had counted for something more than getting through the night. He didn't look at it too closely. He just let it sit there in the passenger seat where the heat exchanger had been and drove home. His house was cold. He always turned the heat down when he left on calls. Old habit, energy efficiency, the kind of small discipline that had become reflex over the years. He turned it back up now, dropped his gear bag by the door, and stood in the kitchen that had 4 chairs with 3 of them holding tools. He stood there for a minute longer than he usually did. Then he moved his toolboxes to the floor, for the first time, without thinking too hard about why. 3 days later, his phone buzzed with the number he recognized. Hi, it's Elena Cross, Sutter Road. Just wanted to let you know the furnace is still running great, and to say thank you again. Lily keeps asking when the heater man is coming back, so apparently you made an impression. He read the message twice. He typed back, good to hear. Let me know if the pressure does anything unusual. He stared at what he'd written for a moment, then deleted the last sentence and wrote instead, "Good to hear. Glad she's warm." He sent it before he could second-guess it again. He set the phone down, went back to his paperwork, and found himself, without any clear intention, almost smiling. Outside, the snow was still falling over Blackridge, Montana, steady and cold and completely indifferent to the small, tentative thing that had begun the night a repairman drove into a storm that everyone else refused. It didn't look like a beginning, but that's the thing about beginnings. They rarely do. The snow kept Declan busy through the rest of that week, the way it always did. Pipes bursting in town, a school boiler that gave out on a Tuesday, an elderly man on Crestline Avenue whose furnace had been wheezing since October and finally gave up the fight entirely. He worked the way he always worked, methodical and quiet, moving from house to house with the particular focus of a man who didn't have anything waiting for him at home that required his attention. But something had shifted, and he noticed it in small ways. He noticed that he checked his phone more than usual between jobs. He noticed that when Elena's name came up, not often, just the occasional text about the furnace, about whether the new part was holding, he read the message twice before answering, the way you read something you want to get right. He told himself it didn't mean anything. He was good at telling himself things didn't mean anything. It was a skill he'd developed out of necessity 3 years ago and had kept sharp ever since. It was Elena who broke the pattern 10 days after the storm, with a text that didn't have anything to do with furnaces at all. Lily wants to know if the heater man eats dinner. I told her that's a strange question to ask about a grown man, but she's very committed to the idea. If you're free Thursday, we'd like to have you over. Nothing fancy, just to say thank you properly. He read it standing in the parking lot of a hardware store in Blackridge, a bag of fittings in one hand, and felt something in his chest do a small, unfamiliar thing. Not quite nerves, not quite hope, but adjacent to both. He typed, "Heater man does in fact eat dinner. Thursday works." Then, because it felt incomplete, tell her I said yes before she has to ask twice. A few minutes passed. Then, she says good. She was prepared to ask 3 times. He smiled at his phone in a parking lot in sub-zero weather, which was not a thing he did, and put it away before anyone could see. Thursday came with a clear sky and a temperature that felt almost generous after the week they'd had. 11 degrees, which in Blackridge passed for a mild evening. He showered, changed out of his work clothes, stood in front of his closet for an embarrassingly long time trying to figure out what a person wore to dinner with a woman and her 6-year-old daughter, and eventually settled on a flannel shirt that wasn't the one he wore to job sites and a clean pair of jeans. He almost brought flowers. He stood in the grocery store with a bouquet of carnations in his hand for nearly a full minute before putting them back, deciding it would read as more than what this was. Whatever this was. He brought a 6-pack of root beer instead, because Lily had mentioned root beer floats during her cartoon monologue 8 days ago, and he had, for reasons he didn't examine too closely, remembered. The farmhouse looked different in daylight without a blizzard tearing at it. Smaller, somehow, and warmer. Not just in temperature, but in the way a house looks when somebody has put effort into it. There were curtains in the front windows he hadn't noticed that first night, and a wreath made of dried wildflowers on the door, and smoke curling steady and even from the chimney, proof the furnace was doing its job. Lily answered the door before he'd even knocked, which suggested she'd been watching from the window. "You came," she said, with the same gravity she brought to everything. "Said I would. Mom's making chicken. It's not very good, but she tries hard." "Lily," Elena's voice came from the kitchen, somewhere between amused and mortified. "It's true," Lily said, unbothered, stepping back to let him in. The chicken, as it turned out, was fine. Better than fine, actually, roasted with potatoes and carrots in a way that suggested either a good recipe or genuine effort, possibly both. They ate at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd had coffee with Elena at midnight, and the conversation moved easily in a way dinner conversations with near strangers usually didn't. Lily dominated most of it, narrating her day at school with the same thoroughness she brought to cartoon plots, occasionally pausing to ask Declan pointed questions. Did he have kids? Did he have a dog? Why didn't he have a dog if he didn't have kids? Wasn't that sort of sad? That Elena tried and mostly failed to redirect. I had a dog, Declan said, answering the one question that had landed somewhere real. A few years back, old guy, healer mix. What happened to him? He got old, Declan said simply. That's what happens to dogs eventually. Lily considered this with the seriousness of someone filing away important information. That's sad, she said, but also normal, I guess. Yeah, he said. Sad and normal. Both at once, a lot of the time. He felt Elena's eyes on him for a second longer than the conversation strictly required, like she'd heard something underneath the words that Lily hadn't. After dinner, Lily disappeared to do the root beer floats, a project she undertook with total independence, refusing help, dragging a step stool to the counter, and narrating her own process while Declan and Elena sat at the table with the dishes still between them. She likes you, Elena said quietly, once Lily was occupied enough not to be listening. She doesn't like people easily. Not since... She stopped. Since her dad, Declan said. Not a question, just naming what she'd left unsaid. Elena nodded slowly. Gavin wasn't around much the last year or so before we left. And when he was around, it wasn't... She turned her water glass a quarter turn on the table, a small fidgeting motion. It wasn't good. For either of us. Lily picked up on more than I wanted her to. You don't have to tell me, Declan said. I'm not asking you to. I know. She looked at him. I think that's part of why I'm telling you. He didn't say anything to that. He let it sit there between them, because some things didn't need a response. They just needed to be received. What about you? She asked after a moment. You said you had a dog. You haven't said much else. He was quiet for a beat. He wasn't a man who volunteered things easily either, and he recognized the symmetry in that. Two people who'd both learned, for different reasons, to keep their hands close to their chest. My wife died 3 years ago, he said. Sarah. Car accident, actually. Not weather, not anything dramatic. Just a bad intersection and bad timing. He turned his own glass, an unconscious echo of her gesture a moment earlier. I work a lot. That's mostly what I do now. Work and go home and do it again. I'm sorry, Elena said. And she didn't say it the way people usually said it. Quickly, as a formality, eager to move past the discomfort. She said it like she meant it, and let a real silence follow. It's been 3 years, he said. People expect you to be further along than I am by now. There's no schedule for that, Elena said. I don't think there's a schedule for any of it. Grief, or... She gestured vaguely, encompassing more than grief, encompassing whatever had happened to her own life. Any of it. No, he agreed. I guess there isn't. Lily arrived at the table at that moment with 2 root beer floats listing dangerously in her small hands, foam already spilling over the rims, and announced with great pride that she had made them completely by myself, except Mom helped a little. And the conversation moved on to safer ground, the way conversations do when a 6-year-old decides it's time. But something had passed between Declan and Elena in those few minutes at the table. Not resolved, not named, but acknowledged. 2 people who had both been carrying something heavy for a long time, setting it down for just a moment to look at each other clearly. That dinner became the first of many. Over the following weeks, as January gave way to a February that brought more snow, but somehow felt less brutal than the storm that had started everything, Declan found himself at the farmhouse on Sutter Road with increasing, almost embarrassing regularity. He fixed the loose porch step that Elena had been meaning to get to for months. He replaced a section of gutter that had pulled away from the roofline. He helped Lily build a snow fort in the side yard that, by her exacting specifications, required actual walls, not just piles, and spent an entire Saturday afternoon packing snow into shapes while Lily directed operations with the seriousness of a construction foreman. He told himself each time that it was just helping out, that he had the skills and the time, and it would be strange not to offer. He was aware, somewhere underneath that explanation, that it was also something else, that he looked forward to the drive out to Sutter Road in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything in a long time, that the farmhouse had started to feel like a place rather than a job site, that Lily's chatter and Elena's careful, watchful warmth had become something he thought about on the days he didn't see them. Elena, for her part, was slower to let herself feel any of it. She'd built her caution carefully over 2 years, brick by brick, and she wasn't in any hurry to dismantle it just because a man had driven through a blizzard and then kept showing up afterward. She watched him with Lily more than she watched him with herself, watched how he answered the girl's relentless questions without condescension, how he never once acted like her presence was an inconvenience to whatever he and Elena might have been building between them, how he seemed, if anything, to like Lily's company on its own terms. That mattered to Elena more than anything else could have. Gavin had never managed that, had treated Lily, even when she was a toddler, like competition for attention rather than a person in her own right. Watching Declan crouch in the snow, painstakingly correcting the angle of a fort wall because Lily had declared it wrong, fix it, and doing so without a flicker of impatience, did something to Elena that she didn't have words for yet. "You're good with her," she told him one evening in late February, after Lily had finally been wrestled into bed, and the two of them sat on the porch steps despite the cold, mugs of coffee warming their hands more than the air around them warmed anything else. "She's easy to be good with," Declan said. "She tells you exactly what she thinks. Makes it simple. Most adults aren't built that way." "No," he said. "Most adults spend a lot of energy not saying what they think." Elena looked over at him. "Is that what you're doing? Not saying what you think?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark shape of the barn against the snow. "Probably," he admitted. "Habit, I guess. Easier to keep things simple." "What would you say," Elena asked carefully, "if you weren't keeping things simple?" He turned to look at her. The porch light cast half her face in shadow, and her breath fogged faintly in the cold, and she was watching him with an expression that was somewhere between brave and terrified, the specific look of someone who had asked a question she wasn't entirely sure she wanted answered. "I'd say I like coming out here," he said slowly. "More than I should, probably, for a guy who fixed your furnace once and kept finding excuses to come back. I'd say I think about you and Lily on the days I don't see you, which isn't something that's happened to me in 3 years, and it scares me a little how much I've gotten used to it already." Elena didn't say anything right away. She looked down at her mug, then back up at him. "I've been telling myself it's just gratitude," she said quietly, "that I'm grateful, and that's all this is. And it's safer to call it that, because the last time I let myself feel something for a man, it cost me 2 years of my life and nearly cost me more than that. I don't trust easily anymore, Declan. I'm not sure I trust easily at all." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to trust me right now. I'm just telling you where I'm at." "That's a fair distinction," she said, and something in her voice loosened just slightly. "I appreciate that you're not asking for more than you're asking for." "I've got time," he said. "I'm not in a hurry. Haven't been in a hurry about anything in 3 years, honestly. I can wait for you to catch up, if catching up is even the direction you're headed." Elena was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the snow-covered yard, at the half-finished fort Lily had insisted on preserving rather than letting it melt or collapse naturally, at the whole strange, unplanned shape her life had taken since a blizzard nearly froze her daughter and a stranger had driven through it anyway. "I think it might be," she said finally. "The direction I'm headed. I just need it to go slow." "Slow's fine," Declan said. "Slow is good, actually." They sat there a while longer, not saying much else, the cold settling around them in a way that felt less like a threat now, and more like just weather, something to be endured together, rather than alone. Spring came late to Blackridge that year, the way it always did, snow lingering into April in stubborn patches under the tree lines, even as the days lengthened and the worst of the cold finally loosened its grip. Declan's visits to Sutter Road had become so regular by then that Lily had started keeping a small drawer in the kitchen with things that were specifically his, a coffee mug she'd decided was his mug, a particular chair at the table that had quietly become his chair, a pair of work gloves he'd left behind once and that nobody had bothered to return. It was a Tuesday evening in late April, the kind of evening where the light stretched out gold and slow over the fields, when Elena found him in the side yard fixing a fence post that didn't strictly need fixing yet, the kind of small, unnecessary task he'd started inventing as excuses to be useful, to be present, without making a bigger declaration out of it. "You don't have to keep finding things to fix," she said, leaning against the fence and watching him work. "You could just come visit. We'd let you in even without a tool belt." He laughed. A real laugh, short but genuine, the kind that had become more frequent around her over the past months. "Old habit," he said. Hard to just sit still in someone's house and do nothing. You sit still here plenty, she said. You just usually have a wrench in your hand while you do it. He set the wrench down on the fence rail and looked at her properly. The evening light caught her hair, caught the small, easier smile she wore more often now than the careful, guarded expression she'd had the first time he'd met her. Elena, he said, can I ask you something? And you can say it's too soon, and I won't push it. Something in her posture went still, attentive. Okay, I'm not asking you to marry me or anything, he said, and she laughed despite herself, the tension breaking slightly. I want you to know that this isn't a temporary thing for me. The way I feel about you, about Lily. I'm not testing it out. I'm not halfway in. I know what I want, and it's this. It's you two. I just wanted to say that out loud, plainly, so you know exactly where you stand with me. Elena was quiet for a moment, looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Something that held both vulnerability and something steadier underneath it. Something that looked, if he had to name it, like a person finally exhaling after holding her breath for a very long time. I know where I stand with you, she said finally. I've known for a while, actually. I think I just needed you to say it before I let myself believe it. Well, he said, I'm saying it. I heard you, she said, and stepped closer. And for the first time since that night in the storm, the distance between them closed completely, and neither one of them was keeping score of who had reached first. The fence post, half fixed, stood forgotten in the gold evening light behind them. It would have been easy in that moment to believe the hardest part was already behind them, that surviving a blizzard and learning to trust again was the whole of what this story demanded of either of them. Elena let herself believe it for a while. She let herself enjoy the ordinary rhythm that had grown up around their lives. Declan's truck in the driveway on weekday evenings, Lily's drawer of his things expanding to include a second mug and a sweatshirt she'd claimed as her own to sleep in, the easy domestic quiet of three people who had found, almost by accident, something that worked. She didn't know yet that the calm was the kind that comes right before something breaks. She didn't know that 2 states away, a man who still considered Lily his daughter in every sense that mattered to his pride, even if not in any sense that mattered to his actual presence in her life, had been watching the quiet contentment of his ex-partner's new life, with a resentment that had been building, slow and ugly, for months. Gavin Holloway did not like being replaced. He especially did not like being replaced by a furnace repairman. And in May, with the snow finally gone from the fields around Sutter Road and the farmhouse settled into the easiest stretch of peace it had known in years, he decided he'd had enough of watching from a distance. Gavin Holloway had spent the better part of 2 years convincing himself that he didn't care what Elena did with her life, that walking away from the farmhouse in Blackridge had been his decision and not hers, even though anyone who'd actually watched the marriage end would have told a different story. He'd told himself a lot of things over those 2 years, that he was better off, that the quiet, isolated life Elena had chosen for herself and Lily was beneath what he could have provided, that he hadn't really lost anything, because you can't lose what you decide to give up. What he hadn't accounted for was Declan Mercer. He'd heard about it first from a mutual acquaintance. Blackridge wasn't a big town, and word traveled the way it does in places where everyone knows everyone's business, whether they want to or not. A heating repairman, sturdy, local, the kind of man who fixed furnaces and didn't own much beyond a truck and a toolbox. Gavin had laughed when he first heard it, actually laughed, alone in his apartment in Helena with a glass of scotch in his hand, because it seemed like such a small, unimpressive thing to lose to. He'd built a career in commercial real estate. He drove a car that cost more than most houses in Blackridge. And Elena, careful, cautious Elena, who'd taken 2 years to even let him fully into her life, had apparently handed her heart to a man who smelled like furnace oil for a living. The laughter hadn't lasted. Somewhere underneath the contempt, something else had started to curdle. A slow, ugly resentment that grew every time he thought about it, which was more often than he wanted to admit. It wasn't about Elena. Not really. Not anymore. It was about the fact that she'd moved on, that she'd built something, a home, a family, a life, without him, and that the something she'd built looked from a distance suspiciously like happiness. Gavin Holloway had never been good at watching other people be happy without him. By May, the resentment had stopped being something he drank away in his apartment and had started becoming something he acted on. He began calling Elena more frequently, always under the guise of wanting to talk about Lily. A visit, a video call, a question about her schooling. But the calls inevitably circled back to questions about this Declan person, delivered with a thin veneer of concern that didn't fool Elena for a second. "I just want to make sure Lily's safe," he said during one such call, his voice carrying the particular smoothness he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while saying something unreasonable. "You don't really know this guy, Elena. A repairman who shows up during a blizzard and suddenly he's living at the house?" "He's not living at the house, Gavin," Elena said, standing in her kitchen with the phone against her ear, watching Lily through the window as she chased something, a rabbit probably, or the idea of one, across the side yard. "And he's not a stranger. I've known him for months. Lily adores him." "Lily's 6. She'd adore anyone who let her win at board games. That's not fair, and you know it." "I'm just saying," Gavin said. "You should be careful. You don't actually know what kind of man he is." What Gavin didn't say, what he didn't even fully admit to himself yet, was that he had already started thinking about ways to find out, and more than that, ways to make sure that whatever he found, real or invented, would matter to a judge. The first time Gavin showed up unannounced at the farmhouse, it was early June, and he was sober, and the visit, while tense, passed without incident. He'd called ahead, technically, even if calling ahead meant a single text sent 20 minutes before he pulled into the driveway. He stayed for an hour, played a stilted round of a board game with Lily that he clearly found tedious, and left with a hug from his daughter that was more obligation than affection, the kind of hug a child gives because she's been told to. Elena watched him drive away that evening with a knot of unease in her stomach that she couldn't quite name. Something about his visit had felt less like a father wanting to see his daughter and more like a man taking inventory of the house, of the yard, of the general shape of the life Elena had built without him. He'd asked pointed questions about Declan that Lily, with her characteristic bluntness, had answered without any sense that she was handing her father ammunition. "Declan fixed our snow fort," Lily had told him, proud. "And he taught me how to use a level. It's this tool that tells you if something is straight." "Does he stay over a lot?" Gavin had asked, too casually. "Sometimes," Lily said. "He has his own mug." Elena had redirected the conversation as fast as she could, but she'd seen something settle into Gavin's expression in that moment. A small, satisfied tightening around his eyes, the look of a man who had just found exactly what he was looking for. She told Declan about the visit that night, sitting at the kitchen table after Lily had gone to bed, her voice tight with the specific anxiety of someone who had learned, the hard way, what Gavin was capable of when he felt entitled to something. "He's building a case," she said. "I know him. I know what that look means. He's not actually worried about Lily's safety. He's worried about losing." "Losing what exactly?" Declan asked. "He left. You didn't take Lily from him. He chose to be 3 hours away and mostly absent." "It doesn't matter what actually happened," Elena said. "Gavin's family has money, and money buys a version of events. If he decides he wants a fight, he won't fight fair. He'll fight to win." Declan reached across the table and took her hand, the gesture simple and steady. "Then we don't give him anything to use," he said. "We just keep living our lives. You're a good mother, Elena. Anyone who actually looks at this house, at Lily, would see that in about 30 seconds. "I hope you're right," Elena said, but the knot in her stomach didn't loosen, not entirely, not for the rest of that night. It was 3 weeks later, on a warm Friday evening in late June, when the knot in Elena's stomach turned out to have been justified all along. Declan had come over for dinner, by then a regular enough occurrence that Lily barely registered it as an event anymore, just the ordinary texture of a Friday. And the three of them had eaten on the back porch, watching the long Montana evening stretch gold and slow over the fields, the kind of evening that made the whole valley look like it had been built specifically for peace. They heard the car before they saw it, an engine too loud and too fast for the gravel road, tires kicking up dust as it came up the drive faster than was reasonable, faster than anyone driving carefully would come up to a house with a child living in it. Elena went still. "That's Gavin's car." Declan was already standing, some instinct in him recognizing the wrongness of the sound before his mind had fully caught up. "Take Lily inside," he said, voice low and even. "Declan, take her inside. Now." Elena didn't argue. She scooped Lily up from her chair, the girl protesting, confused, asking what was happening. and moved toward the back door just as the car came to a stop in front of the house in a spray of gravel, the door flying open before the engine had even fully died. Gavin Holloway came out of the car unsteady on his feet, his tie loosened and askew, his face flushed with the particular redness of a man who had been drinking for hours rather than minutes. He'd never been like this in front of Lily before. Elena had seen him drunk during the marriage, plenty of times, but always behind closed doors, always away from his daughter's eyes. This was different. This was a man who had stopped caring, who saw what he'd become. "Where is she?" he shouted, stumbling slightly on the front walk. "Where's my daughter? I want to see her." "Gavin, you need to leave," Elena said, her voice shaking despite her effort to keep it steady, standing on the porch with Lily's face pressed against her shoulder, the girl's small hands gripping her mother's shirt with a tightness that broke something in Elena's chest. "You're drunk. You can't be here like this." "I can see my own daughter whenever I want," Gavin said, advancing toward the porch steps. "This is still my—" He gestured vaguely at the house, at the yard, at everything. "I have rights. Nobody gets to keep her from me. Not you, and definitely not whatever this is." He jabbed a finger toward Declan, who had moved to stand at the bottom of the porch steps, directly between Gavin and the door. "You need to turn around and get back in your car," Declan said. His voice was quiet, but there was a steadiness underneath it that hadn't existed in his tone before, something that had hardened the moment Lily's frightened face had pressed into her mother's shoulder. "You're not coming any closer to this house tonight." Gavin laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Who the hell are you to tell me where I can go? This is my daughter, my family. You're nothing. You fix furnaces. You're a placeholder some lonely woman picked up because she felt sorry for you." "Maybe," Declan said. "But you're drunk. You're shouting in front of a 6-year-old, and you're not getting past me. So you can stand here and say whatever you want about who I am. Doesn't change where you're standing right now, which is somewhere you don't get to be tonight. Get out of my way." Gavin took another step forward, close enough now that Declan could smell the alcohol on him, thick and sour. "No," Declan said simply. Gavin shoved him. It wasn't a hard shove, not really. Gavin was unsteady, his balance compromised by everything he'd drunk that evening, and the motion was more stumble than strike. But Declan didn't move, didn't stagger back, didn't give an inch. He just stood there, solid as the fence post he'd half-fixed back in April, and looked at Gavin with an expression that contained no anger, only a flat, immovable refusal. "Last chance," Declan said. "Get back in your car." From the porch, Lily had started crying, not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet, frightened crying of a child who didn't understand what was happening but understood enough to know it was bad. Elena held her tight, one hand pressed against the back of her daughter's head, her eyes fixed on Gavin with a mixture of fear and fury that had been building for years and was finally finding somewhere to go. "You're scaring her," Elena said, her voice cracking. "Gavin, look at her. Look at what you're doing." Something in Gavin's face flickered, a brief crack in the rage, a glimpse of the man underneath who maybe, somewhere, still loved his daughter in whatever broken way he was capable of loving anyone. But the crack closed almost as fast as it opened, replaced by something colder, more calculating. "This isn't over," he said, backing away finally, pointing a finger at Declan, then at Elena. "You think you can just replace me? You think this works out for you? I'll see you in court, both of you." He stumbled back to his car, nearly fell getting into the driver's seat, and Declan moved forward fast, faster than he'd moved the whole encounter. "You're not driving," he said, reaching for the door before Gavin could close it. "Not like this. I'll call you a car, or you can sit out here until you're sober, but you are not getting behind a wheel right now." "Get your hands off my—" "I already called the sheriff," Elena said from the porch, her phone in her hand, her voice steadier now that she had something to do, some action to take. "They're on their way. You can wait for them here, sober, or you can try to drive and add a DUI to whatever else tonight turns into. Your choice." Gavin sat there for a long moment, his hand still on the door, looking between Elena and Declan with an expression that was equal parts fury and the dawning, sobering realization that he had badly miscalculated this evening. He didn't try to drive. He sat in his car, engine off, until the sheriff's deputy arrived 20 minutes later, a young officer named Hale, who Elena recognized vaguely from town, who took statements from everyone with the careful, unhurried thoroughness of someone used to domestic calls in a county where everybody eventually had to see everybody else again. Gavin was not arrested that night. There was no clear assault, no property destroyed, nothing that crossed the specific legal threshold that would have justified it, much to Elena's quiet frustration. But the deputy made it unmistakably clear, in front of all three adults, that showing up intoxicated and aggressive at a residence where a minor lived was the kind of thing that got documented, that got remembered, that would matter if it ever came up again. "It'll come up again," Declan said quietly to Elena, after Gavin had been driven away by a friend he'd called to collect him, after the deputy's taillights had finally disappeared down the gravel road, after Lily had finally stopped shaking in her mother's arms and had been carried inside to a bed that felt, for the first time in a long time, less than completely safe. He said it himself, court. "I know," Elena said. She was sitting on the porch steps, the adrenaline finally draining out of her and leaving something hollow and exhausted in its place. "I know what he's like when he feels like he's losing. He doesn't let go easy. He never has." Declan sat down next to her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Then we don't make it easy for him," he said. "Whatever he tries, we face it together. I'm not going anywhere, Elena. Not because of him, not because of anything." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, the night settling quiet and uneasy around the farmhouse. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, but before you know for certain that the storm is really over. It wasn't over, not even close. The custody petition arrived 3 weeks later, delivered by a process server who knocked on Elena's door on an ordinary Tuesday morning while she was getting Lily ready for a day camp session. The kind of mundane domestic moment that made the legal envelope feel almost obscene in its intrusion. Gavin Holloway, through an attorney with a name Elena didn't recognize and a letterhead that looked expensive, was petitioning for full custody of Lily Holloway, citing concerns regarding the minor's living environment and the introduction of an unrelated adult male into the household without appropriate vetting or stability. Elena read the petition standing in her kitchen with her hands shaking, Lily's school backpack still slung over one shoulder, and felt the particular, specific terror of watching someone with money and motive build a weapon out of her own life. The petition didn't stop at concerns about Declan. It went further, painting a portrait of Elena that bore almost no resemblance to the woman who had spent 2 years rebuilding a life out of a blizzard and a broken furnace and slow, careful trust. It alleged isolation, pointing to the remote farmhouse as evidence of instability rather than choice. It alleged financial precarity, citing Elena's modest income from her part-time bookkeeping work as proof she couldn't adequately provide for a child, conveniently ignoring the 2 years of child support Gavin himself had been inconsistent about paying. It alleged, in language careful enough to avoid outright defamation, but pointed enough to do damage anyway, that Elena had exposed Lily to a pattern of transient relationships with unverified individuals. A phrase that made Elena's stomach turn when she understood it was describing Declan, a man who had driven through a blizzard to save her daughter's life and then spent 6 months proving day after day exactly who he was. She called Declan from the kitchen floor, where she'd ended up sitting at some point during the reading, her back against the cabinets, the petition spread out on the tile in front of her like evidence of a crime she hadn't committed. "He's not just angry anymore," she said when Declan picked up. Declan, this is a real legal filing. He's actually trying to take her." "I'm coming over," Declan said immediately. "Don't read any more of it alone. I'll be there in 20 minutes. When he arrived, she was still on the kitchen floor, and he sat down next to her without hesitation, his work boots still on, and read through the petition in silence while she watched his jaw tighten with every paragraph. "This is garbage," he said finally, setting the papers down. "Half of this isn't even true, and the other half is true, things twisted into something they're not." "It doesn't matter if it's true," Elena said, her voice raw. "It matters what a judge believes, and Gavin has the money for a good lawyer, and I have—" She gestured at the kitchen, at the modest farmhouse, at the entire visible shape of her life. "This. A part-time bookkeeping job and a furnace repairman." "That furnace repairman isn't going anywhere," Declan said, "and we're not facing this with nothing. We get a lawyer, a real one. I have savings, not a lot, but enough to help. And we get witnesses. People who've actually seen how you parent, how Lily's doing. what this house is actually like day to day. We don't let him write the only version of this story that gets heard." Elena looked at him, and something in his certainty, steady, unglamorous, entirely without hesitation, gave her something to hold on to that she hadn't had since the process server had knocked on her door that morning. "You'd do that," she said. "You'd actually stand up in a courtroom, risk your name, your reputation, your business, all of it, for this." "I already decided that," Declan said. "Back in the storm, probably, if I'm honest about it. I just didn't know it yet." Elena reached over and took his hand, there on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the scattered pages of a document designed to tear apart everything they'd built. "Okay," she said, "then we fight." Outside, the June evening was settling into the kind of soft, golden dusk that made Montana summers feel briefly, deceptively gentle. No hint in the quiet fields or the lengthening shadows of the battle that was about to begin, the one that would test every piece of the life they'd built since a blizzard had first brought them together, and that neither of them, sitting there on the kitchen floor with their hands clasped tight, had any intention of losing. The lawyer Elena hired was named Patricia Wren, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and a reputation around Blackridge for being unflashy but relentless. The kind of attorney who didn't waste time on theatrics because she'd learned over 20-some years of family court that theatrics rarely won cases. Judges and juries, in Patricia's experience, didn't end up trusting the lawyer who shouted the loudest. They ended up trusting the one who showed up prepared, every time, with the paperwork to back up every claim. "Gavin's team is going to come in hot," Patricia told Elena and Declan during their first meeting, sitting across a cluttered desk in an office above the hardware store on Main Street. "They're going to paint a picture: unstable mother, remote farmhouse, a string of unverified men. That's the narrative. Our job isn't to scream that it's wrong. Our job is to bury that narrative under so much documented, boring, undeniable fact that there's no room left for it to breathe." "Boring facts," Declan said. "The most boring facts you've got," Patricia said. "School attendance records, pediatrician visits, neighbors who can speak to what they've actually seen. The financial situation, laid out clean, with every child support payment Gavin missed documented to the dollar. Judges don't fall in love with stories, Mr. Mercer. They fall in love with consistency." It took most of July to build that consistency. Patricia requested records from Lily's school, where her teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Dunmore, wrote a letter describing Lily as a well-adjusted, secure child who speaks warmly and frequently about her home life. The kind of plain, unremarkable observation that would matter more in a courtroom than any amount of passionate testimony. The pediatrician's office provided records showing regular checkups, all on schedule, all unremarkable in the specific way that meant a child was being properly cared for. A neighbor down the road, an older rancher named Walt Pruitt, who'd known Elena since she moved in, agreed to testify about what he'd actually observed over 2 years. A woman who kept her property in order, who waved at him from the porch most mornings, whose daughter rode the bus to camp every summer with a backpack and a packed lunch like every other kid on the route. Declan, for his part, spent those weeks doing something he found almost more uncomfortable than the custody fight itself: gathering character references for himself. The kind of thing that felt, to a man who'd spent 3 years keeping his head down and his life small, uncomfortably exposed. His longtime customers wrote letters. A woman whose furnace he'd fixed for free 2 winters ago when she was an elderly widow on a fixed income and couldn't afford the part, wrote 3 paragraphs about his character that made him have to set the letter down and walk outside for a minute before he could keep reading it. His own sister, who lived in Spokane and who he hadn't spoken to as often as he should have in the years since Sarah died, flew in for 2 days just to sit with Patricia Wren and answer questions about her brother's character under oath, if it came to that. "You didn't have to do all this," he told Elena one evening in early August, the two of them going through a stack of documents at her kitchen table, the same table where this had all somehow started with a midnight cup of coffee. "Any of it. I could have stayed out of the legal part, let your lawyer focus on you and Lily, kept my name out of the filings." "You could have," Elena agreed, "but Gavin made you part of this the second he named you in that petition. If you disappear now, it looks like you had something to hide. If you stand right next to me, it looks like exactly what it is. It's a man who isn't afraid of the truth, because the truth is on his side." "That's a strategic answer," Declan said. It's also true, Elena said. Both things can be true at once. He looked at her for a moment, the late summer evening light slanting gold through the kitchen window, Lily's laughter drifting in faintly from the yard where she was chasing fireflies with a jar she'd insisted on, and felt something settle in him that had nothing to do with strategy at all. I'm not backing out of this, he said. I want you to hear me say it plainly, since that's apparently something I'm supposed to be good at now. Whatever happens in that courtroom, I'm standing next to you, not behind you, not somewhere safe and separate. Next to you. Elena reached across the stack of documents and took his hand. I know, she said. I've known that since the night you carried a heater through a blizzard for a kid you'd never met. I just needed time to believe it was real. Bansi. The hearing was set for the third week of September in the county courthouse in the seat town an hour's drive from Blackridge, a squat brick building that had clearly seen better decades but still carried the particular gravity that courthouses carry regardless of their condition. The sense that whatever happened inside those walls mattered, in a way that nothing outside them quite did. Gavin's attorney, a polished man named Marcus Reeve, who clearly billed by an hourly rate that would have made Patricia Wren laugh out loud if she'd said it to her face, opened with exactly the narrative they'd expected. He painted Elena as a woman who had isolated herself and her daughter on a remote property, financially unstable, emotionally erratic since the divorce, who had introduced a man with no legal or familial relationship to the child into an environment with insufficient oversight or vetting. He brought up the late-night blizzard call as evidence of recklessness. Mr. Mercer, by his own admission, drove through what local authorities considered hazardous, near-impassable conditions to arrive at a stranger's home at midnight, twisting an act of courage into something that sounded, in his careful phrasing, faintly predatory. Declan sat in the gallery, his jaw tight, his hands folded in his lap, and forced himself to stay still through every word of it. Easy, Patricia murmured to him during a recess, catching his expression. Let him talk. The more dramatic he sounds, the better it plays for us when we bring the plain facts in right after. She was right, as it turned out. When their turn came, Patricia didn't raise her voice once. She called Mrs. Dunmore, who described Lily in the same unremarkable, reassuring terms as her letter. And when Reeve tried to press her on whether she'd ever personally observed the home environment, she answered with simple honesty. I haven't, but I see the child Lily brings to school every day, and that child is happy, secure, and well cared for. That tells me something about the home she's coming from. She called Walt Pruitt, who described 2 years of quiet, ordinary good neighboring in a flat Montana drawl that couldn't have sounded less rehearsed if he'd tried, and who, when Reeve asked pointedly whether he'd witnessed instability at the property, simply said, Only instability I ever saw out there was the night that storm took down half the power lines on the county road, and the only person who showed up to help anybody that night was the man sitting right there, nodding toward Declan, a moment that landed in the courtroom with more weight than any rehearsed line could have. Then Patricia called Declan himself. He hadn't expected to be nervous in the specific way he was nervous. He'd stood in front of plenty of difficult customers, plenty of dangerous job sites, and none of it had rattled him the way standing in that witness box did, with Elena watching from the gallery, and Lily, mercifully, kept home with Elena's sister for the day, spared all of this. Mr. Mercer, Patricia said, her tone calm and conversational, can you describe for the court what happened on the night you first met Miss Cross? He told it plainly. The call, the storm, the broken furnace, the heater he'd carried in without charging extra for the night, the part he'd installed the next day, and the invoice he'd written for cost alone. He didn't dress it up. He didn't need to. And in the months since, Patricia continued, what has your relationship with Lily Holloway looked like? I've tried to be steady for her, Declan said. She's 6. Kids that age, they don't need grand gestures. They need somebody who shows up the same way every time. I've tried to be that. I help with things around the house. I listen when she talks about her day, even when it's a very detailed retelling of a cartoon I've heard about 11 times. I've never once tried to be her father. I'm not interested in replacing anybody. I'm interested in being somebody she can count on. When Reeve cross-examined him, he tried the angle Elena had warned them he'd try, painting Declan as an opportunist, a man who'd inserted himself into a vulnerable woman's life and gained financial and emotional advantage from it. Isn't it true, Mr. Mercer, Reeve said, That you essentially provided free services to Miss Cross on multiple occasions? Wouldn't you describe that as an investment of sorts in securing a relationship? Declan looked at him for a moment, and when he answered, his voice was even, without anger, without performance. If you're asking whether I knew the night I drove out there that I'd end up loving that family, no, I didn't know that. I drove out there because there was a kid in a freezing house, and nobody else would go. Everything after that, every dinner, every fence post I fixed that didn't need fixing, every Saturday I spent building a snow fort that collapsed by Tuesday, that wasn't an investment. That was just what it looks like when you care about people. I'm sorry if that's a hard thing for you to recognize. There was a small, sharp silence in the courtroom after that, and even the judge, a measured, unreadable woman named Judge Alvarez, who had given almost nothing away through the whole proceeding, made a brief note on her pad that Patricia later told them was a very good sign. Elena testified last, and it was during her testimony that the case truly turned, not through any dramatic revelation, but through the simple, sustained weight of honesty. Reeve pressed her on the finances, on the remote location, on every angle the petition had raised, and Elena answered each one without flinching, without raising her voice, laying out the actual texture of her life, the bookkeeping work that, while modest, was steady. The choice of the farmhouse, made deliberately for its proximity to her sister and its distance from a marriage that had left her exhausted and afraid. The 2 years of inconsistent child support payments from Gavin that she had at Patricia's instruction, documented meticulously, month by month, an unbroken record of broken promises laid out in cold, undeniable rows. Ms. Cross, Reeves said, his tone sharpening, clearly aware the ground was shifting under him. Would you say you've moved on quickly from your marriage to Mr. Holloway? I'd say I survived it, Elena said quietly, and then I built something afterward that I'm proud of. I don't think there's a required waiting period for healing, Mr. Reeve. I think there's just doing the best you can, every day, for your daughter. And I have done that every single day since the divorce, whether or not it happened on a timeline anyone else thinks is appropriate. Gavin, called to testify in his own defense, did not help his own case nearly as much as his attorney had clearly hoped. Under Patricia's careful, patient questioning, he was forced to account for the night at the farmhouse. The drinking, the shouting, the deputy's report that existed in black and white, unable to be reframed or softened, no matter how Reeve had tried to characterize it beforehand as an isolated lapse born of frustration with limited access to his daughter. Mr. Holloway, Patricia asked, her tone never rising, in the past year, how many of the scheduled visitation dates outlined in your original separation agreement did you actually attend? Gavin hesitated. There were circumstances, work obligations, the distance. I'm going to ask you to answer the question with a number, if you have it, Patricia said. How many, out of how many scheduled? 6, Gavin said finally quietly, out of 19. The number sat in this courtroom for a long moment, doing more damage to his case than any cross-examination could have. Judge Alvarez took 4 days to deliver her ruling, 4 days during which Elena barely slept, during which Declan found himself fixing things around the farmhouse with an intensity that had nothing to do with whether they needed fixing and everything to do with needing somewhere to put the waiting. When they returned to the courthouse for the ruling, Judge Alvarez spoke plainly, without theater, the way the whole case had ultimately been decided, on the strength of consistency over drama. The court finds that Ms. Cross has provided a stable, secure, and loving home environment for the minor child, she said, reading from her prepared notes, and that the allegations raised regarding instability are not supported by the evidence presented. The court further notes a documented pattern, on the part of Mr. Holloway, of inconsistent visitation and an incident of alarming behavior at the family residence that raises legitimate concerns regarding judgment, particularly when intoxicated. Full physical and legal custody of the minor child will remain with Ms. Cross. Mr. Holloway will be granted supervised visitation to occur in a neutral monitored setting, with the schedule and conditions to be reviewed in 12 months pending demonstrated consistent compliance. Elena's hand found Declan's under the table before the judge had even finished speaking, and when she finally exhaled, it was the kind of breath that felt like it had been held for months, maybe longer, maybe since long before any of this had started. Gavin sat at his table, his face unreadable. The polished confidence he'd carried into the courtroom 3 weeks earlier, replaced by something smaller and more deflated. A man finally confronted with the consequences of a story he'd tried to write that the facts simply hadn't supported. Outside the courthouse, in the thin gold light of a September afternoon, Elena stood on the steps with Declan beside her and let herself cry. Not from sadness, not anymore, but from the simple, overwhelming release of fear that had finally, after months, been allowed to leave her body. "It's over," she said. "It's over," Declan agreed, his arm around her shoulders. Steady, the way he'd been steady since the first night he drove through a storm nobody else would face. "Let's go get Lily. Let's go home." Winter came back to Blackridge the way it always did, without apology, but the house on Sutter Road met it differently this time. The furnace ran clean and quiet, the part Declan had installed 2 winters ago still doing exactly what it was supposed to do. And when the first real storm rolled through in November, Elena found herself standing at the same kitchen window where she'd once watched the world disappear into white. Except this time, she wasn't alone, and she wasn't afraid. Declan had moved most of his things into the farmhouse by then, slowly, the way he did most things. Not in one dramatic gesture, but in 100 small ones that added up before either of them had quite noticed the total. A second toolbox in the mudroom, his clothes sharing space in the closet, the house in town, the one with the kitchen table that had held 3 chairs of tools for years, sold that fall to a young couple just starting out, people who looked at the empty rooms the way Declan once had, like a place that simply hadn't found its purpose yet. He didn't feel sentimental watching them sign the papers. If anything, he felt relief, the particular relief of finally setting down something he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it had weight. "You don't miss it?" Elena asked him once, the two of them sitting on the porch on a clear October evening, watching Lily try, with great determination and limited success, to catch the last fireflies of the season in a jar. "Miss what exactly?" "The old house. Your life before." Declan thought about it honestly before answering, because she deserved an honest answer, and he'd learned over the past year and a half that honesty was the only currency that actually meant anything between them. "I miss Sarah," he said. "That doesn't go away, and I don't think it's supposed to. But the house? No. The house was never really a life. It was just a place I went to be alone after she died. This..." He gestured at the porch, at the yard, at the lit windows behind them where Lily's school drawings were taped to the kitchen wall in chaotic, joyful clusters. "This is a life. I didn't understand the difference until I had both versions to compare." Elena reached over and took his hand, the gesture so familiar now it barely registered as a gesture anymore, just the natural shape of sitting beside him. "I used to think being careful was the same thing as being safe," she said. "I spent 2 years after Gavin being careful with everyone, including you, at the start. I thought if I just kept enough distance, nothing could really hurt me again. And now I think being careful was just another way of being alone," she said. "It felt safe because nothing was happening. But nothing happening isn't the same as being okay. You drove through a blizzard to get to us. I think some part of me knew, that very first night, that I wasn't going to be able to keep being careful around a man like that. I just needed a long time to stop being scared of what that meant." Gavin, for his part, had kept mostly to the conditions the court had set. The first few supervised visits had been stiff, awkward affairs in a family services office in the county seat, a social worker present in the room taking notes while Gavin tried, with visible effort, to be the kind of father he'd rarely managed to be when nobody was watching. It would have been easy to write him off entirely. Elena had certainly earned the right to, after everything. But something in Lily's continued, uncomplicated love for her father, the way she still talked about him with the same blunt honesty she brought to everything, made Elena reluctant to close that door completely, even after everything he'd put them through. "He's trying," Lily told Declan one afternoon, with the specific, unguarded honesty of a child reporting facts rather than opinions. "He's not very good at it yet, but he's trying." "That counts for something," Declan said. "Do you think he'll ever be good at it?" Declan considered the question seriously, because Lily asked everything seriously and deserved answers that matched. "I don't know," he said. "Some people get better at being who they want to be. Some people don't. I think the only thing you can really do is let him keep trying and watch what he actually does, and decide for yourself what that's worth. You don't owe him forgiveness just because he's your dad, but you don't have to close the door either, unless you want to. That part's yours to decide whenever you're ready to. Lily nodded slowly, filing this away the way she filed away everything, and went back to her drawing. And Declan thought, not for the first time, that this, answering a child's hard questions honestly instead of dodging them, was its own kind of repair work, not so different really from the kind he did for a living. You found what was broken. You didn't pretend it wasn't. And then you did the patient, unglamorous work of fixing it, one piece at a time, without expecting it to be perfect when you were done. Just functional, just better than it had been. But spring returned to the valley the way it does in Montana, reluctantly at first and then all at once, snowbanks collapsing into mud, the fields around the farmhouse turning green in patches that spread wider every week until the whole valley seemed to exhale after a long winter-held breath. It was on one of those early spring evenings, the light stretching gold and soft over the fields, the way it had that evening 2 years earlier when Declan had first said the quiet part out loud, that Elena found him in the side yard again, this time not fixing a fence post, but standing at it with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the land like he was working up to something.
"You're doing the thing," she said, coming to stand beside him. "What thing?" "The thing where you look like you're about to say something important, and then spend 10 minutes deciding how to say it." He laughed, caught. "Yeah, that thing." He turned to face her properly. "I wasn't going to make a big production out of this. I know that's not really either of our styles." "Out of what, Declan?"
He didn't kneel, didn't produce a ring with any theater. He just reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small box, plain, the kind you'd find at a jeweler in Whitefish rather than anywhere fancier, because that was who he was, and he wasn't going to pretend to be someone else for the sake of a moment. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Longer than I probably should have waited to actually say it. I'm not asking because I think it'll fix anything that isn't already working. We've got something good, Elena, already, just like this. I'm asking because I want to make it permanent, on paper, in front of everybody who's watched us get here. I want to be Lily's father in every way that's actually mine to claim, if she'll have me, and I want to be your husband, if you'll have me. I'm not scared of slow anymore, but I don't want slow to be the only speed we ever move at." Elena looked at the box, then at him, and didn't bother trying to keep the tears back this time because there was nothing left in her that needed protecting from this particular kind of feeling. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. You drove through a blizzard for us, Declan. I think I decided yes a long time before you actually asked." They told Lily that evening, and her reaction was, predictably, entirely her own. Not surprise, not excitement exactly, but a kind of satisfied, matter-of-fact approval, as though she'd been expecting this development for some time and was simply glad the adults had finally caught up to her own assessment of the situation. "Does this mean you're really my dad now?" she asked Declan, "not just unofficially?" "If you want me to be," he said. "I'm not going to push that on you. You've got a father already, even if things with him are complicated. You get to decide what you call me, whenever you're ready." Lily considered this with her usual gravity. "I think I'm ready now," she said. "I've basically been calling you Dad in my head for like a year anyway. I just didn't want to confuse anybody." Declan had to look away for a moment, out the kitchen window at the darkening fields, before he trusted his voice enough to answer her. "Well, they married the following spring, a year almost exactly from the day he'd asked her in the side yard, in a ceremony held right there on the farmhouse property, beside the barn that still leaned the same way it always had, because Elena had refused, on principle, to let anyone fix it. "It's leaned that way the whole time I've known this place," she'd told Declan when he'd offered more than once to straighten it properly. "Some things are allowed to stay a little crooked and still be exactly what they're supposed to be." The wedding wasn't large. It didn't need to be. Walt Pruitt was there, the rancher neighbor who'd testified for them, standing near the back in a suit that clearly hadn't been worn since whatever the last occasion had been. Mrs. Dunmore came, Lily's old teacher, along with a handful of Declan's longtime customers, the elderly widow whose furnace he'd fixed for free years ago among them, leaning on a cane and crying through most of the ceremony in the unembarrassed way that older women at weddings always seemed to manage. Declan's sister flew in from Spokane again, this time for a happier reason, and stood near the front with the particular pride of someone watching a person she loved finally fully come back to himself after years of watching him only half exist. Lily was the flower girl, a role she took on with the same total seriousness she brought to everything, scattering petals along the makeshift aisle with the precise, deliberate care of someone completing an important professional duty. When the officiant, a retired judge from town who'd agreed to do it as a favor, having heard, like most of Blackridge eventually had, some version of how this all started, asked if anyone objected to the union, Lily, standing at the front with her basket of petals, said loudly and without any prompting, "I don't object, I think it's about time," which got the small gathered crowd laughing in the exact way that made the whole ceremony feel less formal and more like what it actually was, a family, finally calling itself by its right name in front of the people who'd watched it become one. Gavin was not there. That had been Elena's decision, made carefully and without anger, more as a matter of boundaries than punishment. The supervised visits had improved over the past year, slow and imperfect but real, and Elena had decided that progress deserved room to keep happening on its own terms, separate from this particular day, which belonged to something Gavin had never been part of building. He sent a card eventually, weeks later, short, awkward, clearly drafted and redrafted, congratulating Lily on her new family, in a way that read like a man still learning, very late and very slowly, what it actually meant to put his daughter's well-being ahead of his own pride. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, not yet. But it was something, and something was more than they'd had the night he'd shown up drunk in the driveway, and Elena had learned by then not to dismiss small, real progress just because it arrived later than it should have. Declan stood at the front of the gathered crowd that afternoon, in a suit that fit slightly awkwardly because he wasn't a man who wore suits often, and watched Elena walk toward him across grass still damp from the morning, her daughter just ahead of her scattering petals with total focus, and thought about the version of himself who had sat in an empty kitchen with 3 chairs full of toolboxes, telling himself that this, repair work, solitude, the slow gray routine of fixing other people's homes and returning to nothing of his own, was simply what his life had become, and would keep being, indefinitely. That man hadn't known what he was missing. He'd convinced himself there was nothing left to miss, that grief had used up his capacity for anything else, that the work itself was enough of a reason to keep going. He hadn't been wrong, exactly, about how much grief could take from a person. He'd just been wrong about it being permanent. Some things break in ways that genuinely can't be fixed, not all the way, not back to exactly how they were before. But broken doesn't always mean finished. Sometimes it just means there's a different shape waiting on the other side of the repair, one that holds weight in places the original never did. He hadn't gone looking for that shape. Nobody really does. It had found him on the worst night of the worst storm of the year, in the form of a phone call nobody else wanted to answer, and he'd driven toward it without knowing what he was driving toward, only that someone needed help and he had the means to give it. That was the whole lesson, if there was one. Not some grand idea about fate or destiny, nothing that tidy. Just the plainer, harder truth that showing up for people, especially when it costs you something, especially when everyone else has already said no, is sometimes the only thing standing between a frightened child and a freezing house, between a guarded woman and a life she'd stopped believing she was allowed to want, between a grieving man and the family he didn't know he still had room in him to build. The vows they exchanged that afternoon were simple, unremarkable in the way real promises usually are. Nothing performed, nothing borrowed from anywhere but their own 2 years of evidence. Declan promised to keep showing up the same way every time, the way he'd told the courtroom mattered most to a child like Lily, the way he'd apparently been promising without words since the night he carried a heater through a blizzard. Elena promised to keep choosing trust over caution, even when caution had once felt like the only thing keeping her safe, because she'd learned, finally, that the safest thing she'd ever done was let this particular man all the way in. When it was done, when the small crowd had finished clapping and Lily had abandoned her flower basket to hug both of them at once, nearly knocking Elena off balance, Declan looked out past the gathered guests toward the leaning barn, the fields turning green beyond it, the farmhouse behind them with its crooked porch step that he'd fixed properly years ago, and its kitchen window where a frightened woman had once stood watching a blizzard erase the whole world. The valley looked nothing like it had that night. No storm, no whiteout, just ordinary spring light settling soft and warm over land that had seen its share of hard winters and had, somehow, every single time, found its way back to green. Somewhere down the road, neighbors who'd watched the whole thing unfold over 2 winters and 2 springs were already heading toward their cars, talking among themselves the way small towns do, already turning this into the kind of story Blackridge would tell for years. The heating man who drove through the worst storm anybody could remember and ended up driving straight into the rest of his life. Declan didn't think of it as a story, not standing there with Elena's hand in his and Lily's arms wrapped around both their waists at once. He just thought of it as Tuesday, the kind that used to feel impossible to imagine and now felt like the only kind of Tuesday he ever wanted again. The furnace, somewhere inside the house behind them, hummed on quietly, doing exactly what it was built to do. It had been doing that for 2 years now. It would keep doing it for many more.